Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. On this episode, we are looking into Russia's war in Ukraine. Now we're in the final stretch before Donald Trump's second term as the former and also future president prepares to return to the White House on January 20th. Both sides in the war are scrambling to grab every bit of tactical advantage they can. And meanwhile, Donald Trump has appointed retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg as his special envoy for Russia and Ukraine. His job? Well, negotiate peace. Kellogg's pitch includes delaying Ukraine's NATO membership in exchange for a comprehensive and verifiable peace deal. Sounds reasonable. The only problem is that Putin treats peace deal like New Year's resolutions. He makes them, breaks them, and then denies that they ever existed. So, without further ado, let's take a look at the current outlook on the issue at hand.
The German Chancellor comes with a visit to Kiev at a crucial moment in the war. Accompanied by the Ukrainian president, they paid their respects to Ukraine's fallen. This is Scholz's second visit to war-torn Ukraine. Germany is one of the NATO members that isn't too keen on approving Ukraine's bid to join the alliance. Though this trip is meant to be a sign of solidarity, the issue of NATO accession remains a stain on it. Germany isn't the only one with reservations. The US, under Donald Trump, isn't expected to change Washington's stance on swift NATO accession for Ukraine. There are rumors of Ukraine ceding the territories occupied by Russia in exchange for membership, but Zelenskyy himself has ruled this out.
There can't be a NATO invitation in exchange for some parts of Ukrainian territory. It would mean an automatic recognition that all the other territories are not only in danger, but are not part of Ukraine. That's why Ukraine will never go for it.
The war has entered a particularly brutal stage. Russia has been intensifying attacks against civilian targets and critical infrastructure. As winter is reaching out to grip Ukrainians with its icy claws, these Russian attacks are leaving them without power and heat, putting them in severe danger. And as for 2025, the year in which serious peace negotiations are expected, Russia will be investing even more into its military. Many in Ukraine strongly believe that the only possible countermeasure to protect the country is the long sought-after NATO membership.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. The current outlook among many analysts, correspondents, and watchful observers of current affairs is that there are just 7 weeks left for meaningful changes in the front lines in Ukraine before the January political reset. 7 weeks. That's less time than it takes for a TikTok trend to go from viral to cringe. Both sides are desperate to end the war on their terms, and I might remind you that there's some high stakes in this game. Russia wants leverage, Ukraine wants survival, and NATO just wants to make it through this mess without losing another submarine cable. Now, what happens when you mix desperation with heavy artillery? Spoiler alert, it's not great. Evidence of escalation is everywhere. Russia's been extra busy lately, deploying North Korean troops, loosening the safety on nuclear weapons, and firing a new kind of missile at Ukraine. Now, the last one feels a little overkill, like showing up to a bar fight with a bazooka, but that's Putin for you. Subtlety isn't his strong suit. Meanwhile, Ukraine has started firing long-range Western-made missiles into Russian territory. It's a bold move, and frankly, who can blame them? And then there's Donald Trump, the orange-tinted specter looming over all this chaos. He's promised to end the war within a single day of taking office. Now, Trump has appointed a peace envoy for Russia and Ukraine. Keith Kellogg is a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General and seasoned government official who's worked under Trump in his previous administration. Kellogg himself has floated the idea of withholding NATO membership for Ukraine as a bargaining chip. It is therefore understandable that his appointment has been met with skepticism in Kyiv. But let's be honest, does Putin even want peace? We're inclined to say no, because why negotiate when you can wait, regroup, and invade again later? It's like giving up a good parking spot when you're still in the middle of a shopping mall of geopolitical ambition. Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly agrees, warning that Putin has no red line. So, what's Putin's endgame? It's safe to say that he's not just at war with Ukraine, he's at war with the entire West. His ultimate goal is to tear down the so-called rule-based international order. I'd say it's shocking, but after the past couple of years, my shock threshold is lower than a ruble. So, some believe there are to be the final months of this brutal, grinding war. But as the clock ticks down, let's not forget who this war impacts the most. Ordinary people caught in the crossfire of history. Let's hope that their voices aren't drowned out in a rush to make deals, draw lines, or fire missiles, because if there's one thing we've learned, it's that wars may end, but the consequences last forever. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Maria Zelenskyy, Head of Regional Security and Conflict Studies, Ilko Kuchev Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thanks for having me.
So we are trying to decipher some of the plans for Ukraine going forward, especially when it comes to the diplomatic solutions front. We've seen somewhat mixed messages coming out from the President Zelenskyy, some saying that he won't be satisfied with any security guarantees. That's not an outright NATO membership. But there's also talks about negotiation and diplomatic means to be the only way to regain lost territory. At the same time, there's also talks about, having to compromise some territory in order to be a part of NATO. So all these messages coming in at the same time makes it really hard to kind of pin down where Zelenskyy sees the negotiation going when it comes to settling this conflict.
Almost everything is correct, in terms of what messages are circulating in the public discussion, except for the fact that someone, including President Zelenskyy, is agreeing to some kind of legitimization of Russian occupation over temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. The only thing which is being heavily discussed now, again, because this is not the first time this idea has appeared, is about NATO membership for Ukraine, even with Ukrainian territories, part of Ukrainian territories being under the Russian control. And all these things about NATO membership on the one hand, or security guarantees not less than NATO membership, are interconnected basically with the perspective of negotiations. Ukraine does not see any logic and any rationale in stepping in the negotiations with Russia or indirectly with Russia through the US or anyone else mediation, without clear perspective how Ukraine will be secured from another attack on the side of Russia. And that's why we're just looking for any kind of guarantees. If it's NATO membership, that's the best option. If someone among Ukrainian partners is ready to give Ukraine a collective clause similar to Article 4 and 5 of Washington Treaty for NATO, then it will be also okay. But we see that no one is ready to provide Ukraine with those security guarantees on a bilateral basis. That's why NATO remains the main perspective and priority for Ukraine now.
Right, and it does seem like, drawing lessons from the Budapest Memorandum, where a lot of guarantees, a lot of talks were being made, and it kind of fell by the wayside when the conflict actually began. So, however, we do also see that the U.S. doesn't seem to see NATO as an option. Is there any compromise that eventually could be reached? Is there any course of dialogue that you think Ukraine can pursue in order to kind of mend these differences?
The reference towards Budapest Memorandum is not accidental, actually, in the current statement on the side of Ukrainian Ministry for Foreign Affairs, because in Budapest Memorandum there was a clash of two visions. While Western partners of Ukraine, who were with Russia together, by the way, were guarantors for Ukraine's security when Ukraine voluntarily refused from its third world largest nuclear arsenal. They were guarantors for Ukraine's security on the one hand, from Ukrainian point of view. But from the Western point of view and from Russia's point of view, those were not the guarantees, but rather assurances, which led to vacuum of security for Ukraine once Crimea was annexed in 2014 and hybrid warfare in Donbass started, and then large-scale invasion in 2022. For this reason, Ukraine see that anything similar to Budapest Memorandum, even with a different title, will not work out. What's the main goal now? If we speak about the ceasefire, because I don't see that a huge political or big political deal is possible about strategic political resolution of the conflict, position of Ukraine and Russia are too different right now, then we have to have an understanding what's next after the ceasefire, for instance, is declared. To what extent Ukraine will receive military aid the very next day, who will try to prevent another stages of Russia's further attacks, or West will just close their eyes and just think that solution is back is there on this stage. No, for this reason we should refuse anything which is similar to empty clothes, like unfortunately Budapest Memorandum turned out to be.
Right, you brought up a very good point because, well, a lot of these ceasefire deals, even if they are made, there's very little guarantee that things could remain the same. And we know Russia is always lurking at the corner, looking for an opportunity to pounce on. So the question next would be, like, how will these countries come together with a more comprehensive plan to make sure that things don't progress the same way that it did, right?
In my opinion, the main problem is that partners of Ukraine in the West, unfortunately, don't see the prospect for providing Ukraine at this very moment with something which is, on the other hand, is really needed for regional security and peace, for predictability. Russia will not go further in case they understand that the price will be much higher. At this very moment, neither sanctions nor military aid provided to Ukraine will not prevent Russia from planning occupation of Ukraine in the nearest years, continuing with that, or with starting hybridly or conventionally attacks on NATO and EU member states. West, in my opinion, started thinking in a very risky way during last year. They are not afraid that Russia will attack them at some point. The vision of the war between Russia and Ukraine appeared to be, again, like after 2014, to some extent more local. There is a Ukrainian battlefield. Russia has almost used all its military resources to attack Ukraine and will be not capable of attacking hybridly or conventionally, none within the NATO and EU, which appears to be not true if we have a look at how Russia is doubling down on its military production, like any country in the West is doing at this very moment.
Right, you brought up a very good point with Russia doubling down on its military investment, and perhaps we do observe a little bit of rhetoric coming from the West when regarding to the war in Ukraine. The way that it is being discussed is mostly about ramping down the support for Ukraine. A lot of talks, the incentive structure for going into peace talks, the ceasefire, is that they cannot keep providing Ukraine aid, which runs very counter to what Russia is doing right now. In order for the West to want to pursue this peace deal is for them to invest less in Ukraine while Russia is still ramping up its own military industrial complex. So I think I'm starting to understand what you mean by the dangerous precedence, as this peace could only be temporary if Russia is still kind of reboosting its strength and the West seeing it as a way to pull out support for Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. You have got my idea absolutely right. The issue is that both Ukraine and Russia want a strategic outcome out of this war, but the vision of the strategic resolution of the conflict is absolutely opposite. Russia wants to increase its weight on the European continent and rearrange the power, at least in Europe, with making Russia the great power again. And they are backed by all those partners, all those allies here, China, Iran, North Korea, while Ukraine needs a predictable peace as an outcome of this war, and not to be swallowed by Russia anytime in the future. And these are contradictions. There is a contradiction basically here. So from this point of view, a resolution of the conflict, a political deal, is impossible here. And the only thing which is possible is any kind of narrow, very tactical negotiations and deal about something, like we have in 2022 so-called grain deal, when a narrow route for sea export of Ukraine was open and then Russia withdrew 1 year after that from this agreement. Then there is a negotiation track between Ukraine and Russia about the prisoners of war exchange. The third track, which is less successful, is about return of kids, Ukrainian kids who were deported to Russia. And but the ceasefire is another, I would say, the only one possible track which will be in place after Trump starts his actually presidential term in practice. But the problem is that ceasefire is a tactical instrument. It is not a strategy. And for the idea for Ukraine is to make our Western allies, especially Trump right now, make understand that we cannot rely on a ceasefire. We don't have guarantors. We will not have even observatory mission like we had between 2014 and 2022. There was an OSCE special monitoring mission on the ground. Now we won't have any perspective of boots on the ground because any army in Europe is brave enough to send their soldiers to even to monitor the ceasefire or to monitor, for instance, the state border between Ukraine and Belarus. We would need not boots on the ground even for the front line. Ukraine needs really the boots on the ground, for instance, with a police or border guard mission along the Belarus border between Belarus and Ukraine to release thousands and thousands of Ukrainian soldiers who have to guard that part of Ukrainian border to prevent the attack from Belarus territory, and we would be able to release them and send them back to help other parts of Ukrainian army on the real front line inside Ukrainian territory. We don't have any prospect of, this ceasefire to be not fragile, not temporary, but stable and long-lasting, unfortunately. And that's why I believe negotiations will take place, or attempts of negotiations will take place, but this ceasefire will not bring any peace and, unfortunately, no resolution to this conflict, even if it's declared.
Right, so this helps us paint a better picture. There's so many factors into this conflict that perhaps the West and Donald Trump's rush to conclude this war might just only bring a temporary halt, as throwing a blanket over the fire is going to be. And eventually, perhaps Russia might lay dormant just for a little bit until the whole thing cannot be contained anymore. So thank you so much for helping us paint this picture and really help us understand a little bit more about the current situation. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. We begin today's coverage with the latest wave of Russian drone attacks across Ukraine. A recent strike in southern Kyiv tragically claimed the lives of 3 people.
For more than 1,000 days, Ukrainians have had to endure sights like these. Buildings, homes even, crumbling and smoking in the wake of a drone attack. Each and every single one of them a dark reminder that to Russia, every target is fair game. This is a pediatric clinic in Kyiv that was hit by drone debris just a couple of days ago. While the attack was reportedly focused on energy infrastructure, it shows that the Russians do not care where the punches land. Other recently targeted cities include Odessa, which in the eyes of the Kremlin remains a crucial piece in this war's puzzle. The new wave of drone and missile strikes is meant to cripple Ukraine's struggling power sector, aiming to drive Ukrainians into darkness as the season's cold closes all around them.
In related news, the Washington Post reports growing discontent among some U.S. officials over Ukraine's war strategy. They're reportedly frustrated with President Zelensky's refusal to lower the minimum age of military mobilization from 25 to 18.
Meetings like this one between Zelenskyy and Biden are always cordial. They are a show of unity in times that desperately need them. But as it is always in diplomacy and policy making, there is more going on behind the smiles and handshakes. In this case, even close allies can butt heads, especially on such volatile matters as warfare. Unnamed US officials have said that no matter what Washington does, what arms it supplies, Ukraine's army will remain outmatched on the battlefield unless it finds new soldiers and bridges the manpower gap. When it comes to arms, however, President Zelenskyy says that Ukraine has received only 10% of allocated aid. Lowering the age of mobilization would be an extremely unpopular move in Ukraine. Political suicide, some would say. But Russia is ramping up military production and its own mobilization campaign is in full swing. The clock is ticking for Kyiv's leaders. Perhaps the time has come for unpopular choices to be considered.
Turning to Georgia, the capital, Tbilisi, has seen ongoing protests for 5 consecutive nights. In response, the Baltic states have presented a united stance, imposing sanctions on the Georgian government for its heavy-handed approach to pro-European Union demonstrations.
The Baltic states are continuing their policy of sticking together. This time they want to support the European aspirations of another former Soviet state and have taken a strong stance. Opponents of democracy and violators of human rights are not welcome in our countries, they say. The ruling Georgian Dream Party, which declared victory in highly disputed elections, recently suspended Georgia's EU accession process. Thousands upon thousands of pro-EU Georgians took to the streets in the wake of the decision, joining the crowds already protesting the election results. They want their voice to be heard loud and clear. We want Europe, we want freedom. And their manifestation was met with a brutal crackdown from the police. Water guns, tear gas and beatings, all regarded as tools of terror to quell dissent in the name of authoritarianism. In the wake of the police's actions, the Baltic states have also hinted at some sort of direct response from the EU, though the details are not yet known.
Shifting to East Asia, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock is in China on a critical diplomatic mission. Her goal is to deliver a strong message to Beijing's leadership regarding their support for Russia.
China has been a Russian ally for quite a while now, even if it's not always clear who is a senior partner in this relationship. The German head of diplomacy seems to want to give China a chance to show initiative. Some Western officials are talking about China's crucial role in the war in Ukraine. Baerbock herself, just prior to leaving for this trip, said that as a permanent UN Security Council member, China was undermining European interests by supporting Russia in the war. Her trip coincides with Olaf Scholz's to Kiev, where he seeks to boost his image as a staunch Ukrainian ally, even if he may not be chancellor anymore when the war ends. Sino-Russian ties have only grown closer since Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, and Germany doesn't seem to have the pull it once had.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.